Hi, everybody. I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. So here's the thing about live radio. Sometimes the best laid plans come apart. We had hoped to talk with singer-songwriter Jonathan Butler for the hour about his life and his music, but unfortunately, he is under the weather. We hope you get well soon, Jonathan. But not to worry, Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander has graciously stepped in, so we're changing topics. Yesterday was the official closing of Fort Monroe. That means a lot of things to a lot of people. From the African-American perspective, there's a history that must be preserved. Coming up next on Another View, what is that history and what's next for Fort Monroe? Right after the news from NPR.
Discussing the issues and celebrating the successes of the African American community. This is Another View.
Hello, everyone. I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. Don't you just love that applause? It's just so cool. And welcome to Another View. Well, I have to tell you, the Another View production team, I must give major thank yous to today because we had to scramble this morning. Unfortunately, Jonathan Butler, who was to be our guest for the hour, was unable to join us. He apparently is sick, and so we wish him the very best. But as they say, the show must go on since we are live with you here from noon until 1 every Friday. So we called our good friend, Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander, and she said, sure, I'll come on over. And we switched up topics a little bit. So I want you to think about something. Think back to when you learned about the Civil War and the ending of slavery. Now, did you ever learn about these people, Shepard Mallory, Frank Baker, or James Townsend? What about Major Benjamin Butler? How about the term contrabands of war and what that had to do with the beginning and the ending of slavery in this country? It's a history lesson that many of us have not learned, and it happened right here in Hampton Roads. And it's particularly significant this week with the closing of Fort Monroe. So, as I said, joining us to talk about this history and how it should be preserved and why is Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander. She's a history professor with Norfolk State University. Cassandra, thank you.
You're more than welcome.
We really appreciate it. So before we get into kind of the history behind, yesterday a historical moment happened, and that was the closing of Fort Monroe. And we've got with us on the line the Vice Mayor of Hampton, George Wallace. Hi, George. How are you?
Good morning. How are you?
Oh, doing great. So you were at the ceremony yesterday. Can you give us a sense of what it was like and how you were feeling? And did you get choked up a little bit?
No, I had mixed emotions. I had a sense of elation in the context of the things that you just mentioned would have a new opportunity to be disclosed and exhibited to our country. This is a piece of history that's kind of been pushed down and held outside of the normal purview of what you normally get and study and learn in your history lessons in school. I know when I was growing up, I was taught that slavery was ended by Abraham Lincoln, and there was no explanation in terms of how that came about. And the actions by General Butler were, in fact, the primary avenue that was developed that gave Lincoln a route to use in terms of freeing the slaves through the Emancipation Proclamation, because a significant amount of it had already been done by the action of General Butler, with thousands and thousands of slaves escaping to Union lines and Union-held space and being free. Mm-hmm. So those significant pieces of history would now be able to be unfolded and disclosed to our nation at large. In addition to that, I also learned that in 1619 that the first slaves that arrived came to Jamestown. Well, in fact, the first slaves that arrived to North America came to Hampton. And that's a piece of Hampton history that needs to be disclosed in that particular context, and also that particular piece of history rectified and straightened out, and as being taught to our children and my grandchildren, who's 9.
George, let me ask you this too. Are you from Hampton?
I was, ironically enough, I was born and raised in Williamsburg.
Okay, so you were born and raised in Williamsburg. You were educated in this area, but you did not know this. It still amazes me how many of us, and I include myself in this, were unaware of this history. And the city of Hampton, this must mean so much to the city of Hampton.
Well, we have a history in Hampton that's replete with accomplishments and things that have happened to the African American in this country in terms of Murray Peak being the educating of slaves prior to it being legal. The fact that the contraband settlement that took place with the John Butler's actions led to most of downtown Hampton being occupied by former slaves. And streets in Hampton like Lincoln Street and Union Street and other streets in Hampton came out of this contraband occupation of our community. Mm-hmm. And there is history that we had black sheriffs and other black elected officials from Hampton by virtue of this particular role.
Mm-hmm. What do you think that President Obama will declare Fort Monroe a national monument, and what would that mean?
Well, the context that most people put to it, yes, the answer is yes, absolutely. I hope that he does that ASAP, or yesterday, as a matter of fact. But what it does do is that it gives us an opportunity to present a whole new perspective.
Mm-hmm. So we, first of all, thank you so much for being able to be with us here today and to talk about the closing yesterday of Fort Monroe. I know that the Army base itself, 188 years,
Correct.
I believe it was in service. And so we appreciate your perspective on that, but also your perspective on the history. And we're going to talk a little bit more with Dr. Newby-Alexander about that too.
Well, I've observed Dr. Newby-Alexander on several panels and boards, and she's an expert in this regard, and I'm sure she'll be able to shed much more light on that issue than I have.
George, you held your own. We appreciate that. Okay. Thanks so much. That's George Wallace. He's the vice mayor of the city of Hampton. And yesterday, our Lisa Godley was also at the closing of Fort Monroe, and she had an opportunity to speak with the commander there. And here's what he had to say. His name is Colonel Anthony Reyes, and he's the garrison commander. He says he's the last commander of Fort Monroe. And here's what he had to say about the closing.
We'll always love Fort Monroe as an Army installation. And, of course, you'll never forget that. But I like to choose to think about what it can be in the future. And some people worry about what may tend to happen at BRAC locations, but I don't see that in this community at all. I see excitement. I see people definitely involved with any and everything that's going to happen out here. I see people that want this place to remain at the standard that the Army kept it at. So for today, I try to be a positive person, so I try to focus on not so much the sad side of this, as I stated in my remarks. I like to focus on what can be positive and great about Fort Monroe, and I think this place has a chance to be the crown jewel of the Hampton Roads community.
And that was Colonel Anthony Reyes. He's was now, as of yesterday, the garrison commander, the last commander at Fort Monroe. And Colonel Reyes is an HU graduate, as Vice Mayor Wallace just sent us a note to remind us of that. So thank you very much. HU meaning Hampton University. For those of you who went to Howard University, we know about that controversy. Absolutely. State Senator Mamie Locke was also at the event yesterday, and she had this to share about the history.
There's so much history here, and it can become not just a place to visit and for the recreation part of it, but for the historic information that's available here. There's a lot that's occurred. There's a lot of individuals who've been here. The contraband story is tremendous. So there's a lot of history that can be shared with not just folks in the Commonwealth, but across the country and the world.
Cassandra, why is this history so new to so many people?
I think for a very long period of time in our American history narrative, we've had a tendency of eliminating or simply not talking about the history that makes us uncomfortable. And you have to remember, at the end of Reconstruction, there was a national effort to eliminate any real discussion that would create controversy between whites in the North and in the South. And that meant really downplaying any history having to do with blacks. There was also an effort to get blacks to comply with a new national system, and that national system we know as Jim Crow or segregation, which really had an exclusionary component to it. It wasn't just separate but equal, which is what the Plessy versus Ferguson case coming down from the Supreme Court said in 1896. You really didn't see separate and equal. You saw separate and exclusionary, and definitely unequal. And so there I think was an effort to take all the material that really talked about slavery, especially from a realistic perspective, which often was negative, and talking about what went on during the Civil War from both perspectives, or from many different perspectives. There was an effort to downplay that and to take that history and essentially put it in a box and throw it in the closet and not talk about it. That's why it was so surprising to me last year when Norfolk State hosted the sesquicentennial conference, Race, Slavery, and the Civil War, the tough stuff of American history and memory, that Norfolk had not created a map. Hampton had not created a map to look at these different sites that were relevant to the entire Civil War. They typically only focused on the Confederate side, with maybe a nod to this monument or that monument that had to do with African Americans, when in point of fact, Fort Monroe and the town or the village of Hampton was involved with the war from either the beginning, as Fort Monroe was, or shortly thereafter. By May of 1861, the end of May, this is when people began to evacuate Hampton Village. And they burned the city down, or they burned the village down, so that the Union troops could not make use of that particular area as a holding point. And then in Norfolk, from May of 1862 onward, that was under Union control. Why is it that there were no maps telling us where were these troops? And if, in fact, starting in 1863, there were schools started by in a joint effort with the American Missionary Association as well as with the Union officials, why don't we know about this? Why isn't this a part of our shared history? And so I got together with the Visitors Bureau, and we created a map that looks at the Civil War in Hampton Roads, and with a focus here in Norfolk, since it became really the headquarters for the Union officials. And it was an exciting opportunity to pull together a view of Hampton Roads in a very different way than it had been before. And each area in Hampton Roads was very different. I mean, what happened in Hampton and in Hampton Village was very different than what happened in Norfolk. What happened in Yorktown or in Warwick County, which is now Newport News, is very different than what happened in Portsmouth or in Isle of Wight. Every area was almost like a microclimate in terms of what occurred.
So it's the closing of Fort Monroe and all of the attention for Fort Monroe causing now the other areas to maybe take a look at their own history, or have we not gotten that far yet?
I think actually the coming commemoration of the 150th anniversary of the Civil War has caused a lot of people to take a second look. And while there's some who want to go to the cult of the lost cause and pulling out all of the stereotypes that have emerged since the end of the Civil War, there are others who've said, well, let's take a different look. And in some ways, this is much like at the beginning of the Civil War, where groups of people are saying, well, wait a minute, I'm going to take charge of my own destiny. This is what the three men who went to the fort and requested that they have sanctuary given to them by General Benjamin Butler, this is what they were saying. They were taking their own destiny into their own hands.
Before we get into that discussion, because I really want to talk very closely about those three men who took that historic step, 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. Give us a call. Let us know what your questions are about the contraband story. Do you even know what it is? Did you learn about it when you were in school? Okay, Cassandra, let's start with Townsend, Mallory, Baker, and Townsend.
Before we get to them, I guess my point was that, like those men, you have groups in this area who have decided, let me take our history into our own hands, and let's make sure that this history, which has not been part of the general narrative, right, that it be included because it is a shared history. While my focus in my field is on African American history, I remind people that this is American history first and foremost, and I'm drilling down to talking specifically about how African Americans played a significant role in whatever was happening at this particular time. And with the population demographics, you can't ignore African Americans. They made up a significant proportion of the Hampton Roads population, close to 40% of the population. And so they provided the work to support the Confederacy, which is why their departure going to the Union lines so impacted the strength of the armies and the initiatives of the Confederate
They were
forces.
leaving the Confederacy and going over to the Union.
Absolutely.
And that was draining their manpower then.
Absolutely. And interestingly, getting back to the question that you were raising about Townsend, Mallory, and Baker, when they arrived at Fort Monroe, it was just a couple of days after Butler arrived. And
General Butler was in charge?
General Butler had just been appointed commander. He was Major General at that time and later became Brigadier General. And he had actually been in Maryland. And he had put forth this idea of a contraband act declaring enslaved people contrabands, but it hadn't gotten anywhere. And when he came here, this moment happened, this important moment. It wasn't something he was trying to initiate. This is something he took advantage of, but it was initiated by these three men who went to the fort and said, we are being used by our owner to help fight against the Union effort, and we don't want this to happen. And they're about to take us to North Carolina, which means we're going to be separated from our family. So we want to have sanctuary here at the fort. And Butler saw this as an opportunity. He didn't like the word contraband because he said it was really limiting. But at the same time, he was a lawyer, and a lot of people don't understand that. That as a lawyer, he understood the law. The Constitution of the United States said that slavery was legal.
Yes.
And so how then do we not adhere to the national law and not break it at the same time? And that's where the issue of if it's a contraband, meaning a forbidden product that could help the other side win the war or win this battle, then I'm not obligated to return this contraband to you in times of war. And so while it was useful legally for him to use it, it was limiting because it didn't really apply to the women and children. It didn't apply to the older men.
Really?
And right, because
Now, see, that I didn't realize, because I thought that meant that everybody who streamed in basically then would be considered contraband.
no, it didn't initially. Now, later, Congress in 1862 would have it apply to all, including free blacks, which, many free blacks despised that term being applied to them as well. But it was a catch-all because it then allowed all blacks to be protected by the Union Army, as opposed to being under the auspices of their state law.
Okay, 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. Lori joins us from somewhere in Virginia. Hi, Lori.
Hi.
Go ahead, you're on the air.
Well, I love viewing plantation homes, and it's wonderful, but I am always cognizant of the fact that they are beautiful because they were built on the backs of slaves. Fort Monroe is a true example of something that was real of black history, that was good and uplifting and inspirational. And thank you to General Butler for his brilliant play on the contraband situation. But it was the folks that were freed that took that and ran with it. And I mean ran with it. Mm-hmm. And were such a part of the history that I am just incredulous that more people don't realize, more people don't know.
Exactly.
I have been incredulous that more has not been publicized about the plans to commercialize, make it a business, make it a political wheel. And it's not. It is real. It is living. The reason it is in such good shape that it is because real families lived there, and they love it because they appreciate, like no one can, the unique, good history of freed slaves.
Mm-hmm. Lori, thank you so much for your call, and let me encourage you to pick up An African American History of the Civil War in Hampton Roads, written by Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander. Cassandra, where can they find your book?
Actually, in a lot of bookstores locally,
bookstores? Okay.
both in Barnes & Noble as well as in the smaller privately owned bookstores.
Okay. To Lori's point.
Well, Fort Monroe, interestingly, used slave labor to help construct the fort and to build the moats. So that's kind of the irony of Fort Monroe. But then few things in the South were not built by African Americans. At what used to be the Gosport Navy Shipyard, which is now the Norfolk Naval Shipyard in Portsmouth, the original dock that built the first battleship for the United States, was built by enslaved labor there at the at that particular shipyard, and so that's not unusual. But what is so important about Fort Monroe for our nation's history, aside from its unique and important location, it was built right there at Old Point Comfort, and that is where the first documented unfree Africans arrived. America had not, and the colony of Jamestown had not yet established a system of slavery. That would ironically be established by the agency that was created the same year that these Africans arrived, and that would be the House of Burgesses.
As a matter of fact, there was just recently an unveiling of a marker,
Yes.
if I'm not mistaken, at Old Point Comfort.
Yes.
To recognize this part of the history.
Absolutely, and it would take about 4.5 decades before the House of Burgesses would actually codify permanent servitude into the laws of Virginia, and then other colonies such as Massachusetts would follow suit, Maryland, etc. There's this perception somehow also that slavery was only legal in the South, when slavery was legal everywhere, and you had every colony in this country at that time with slaveholders. Boston was very much involved in the slave trade, and they were responsible starting in the 1680s, bringing in Africans from the island of Madagascar, which is off the southwest coast of Africa. But Fort Monroe, by the way, is the only surviving site where the contrabands were brought in and resettled during the war.
How many people wound up being contrabands of war?
We have absolutely no idea.
Wow.
And the reason we have no idea is because the movement in and out was very fluid. From the beginning, the people who were coming in and declare contrabands began to enlist. We know that there were at least 4 contrabands who enlisted to be aboard the USS Monitor. when they had the famous ironclad battles between the CSS Virginia and the USS Monitor. We know that there were other blacks who enlisted aboard ships and then were used as contraband armies in 1862, going out to the different neighboring plantations and bringing those who were enslaved to the back behind Union lines and then resettling them on farms where they would begin to get paid as they produced crops and other supplies for the army. So we know that. We also know that that free blacks often were categorized as contraband. So I say if you want a general idea, look at the census of 1860. That gives you at least an idea of how many people were probably contrabands of war, because it was really the population of blacks
of the city of Hampton, or of the
region,
whole region,
and people were coming in. If you look at the descriptive books of the units who were enlisted in the area of blacks, you know that through the Emancipation Proclamation that was issued by President Abraham Lincoln on January 1st of 1863, he set forth the order that there would be a whole unit of United States colored troops organized. And so at Fort Monroe and at Camp Hamilton, you would see the organization of the 1st and 2nd Colored Cavalry. And then between that area and Norfolk, you would see the formation of the 10th U.S. Colored Infantry. And then over in Norfolk and in Portsmouth, you would see the creation of the 36th, 37th, and 38th U.S. Colored Troops Infantry. And in each of these regiments, there were anywhere between 12 to almost 2,000 men enlisted. And these men came from not just the surrounding area, but they came from Accomack County. They came from Eastville. Some of them even came from Washington, D.C. They came from Yorktown. They came from Isle of Wight. They came from Surrey. They came from all over this region and came down here and actually served in those units.
If you're just joining us, this is Another View, and we're talking with Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander, history professor at Norfolk State University, and we're talking about the history of the contrabands of war and Fort Monroe, and a lost history somewhat that is now coming to light in light of what's happening at Fort Monroe. 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. David joins us from Chesapeake. Hi, David. You're on the air.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. You know, it's an interesting topic. You know, talking about this, lost history. I mean, this isn't lost, but it's something that I think that no one's ever focused on. And you're talking about Virginia, and they were kind of on the forefront in leadership and making slavery legal. But I think people have overlooked the real reason behind that, and that was due to one man, Antonio Anthony Johnson. He came here to the U.S. as an indentured servant. I think that a lot of people say that, well, slaves came here. Nah, slaves didn't come here first. It was indentured servants by contract, and which later, after the contracts were up, became, that whole slavery kind of thing kind of spun into that. But Anthony came here, I believe it was from South Carolina or Georgia, migrated here and ended up marrying a Virginia woman. And he purchased freedom of his indentured servant contract a couple of years early, and then he also paid for his wife's freedom. And that proves a positive right there that despite what happened in slavery, this man, black, proved his worth. He earned money and he bought his freedom. But what Anthony then ended up doing was he was a fairly smart individual and an entrepreneur, and he wanted to get into the business for himself. And he liked the luxury of owning slaves or having slavery, having in the servants. So he petitioned the court in Virginia, and he is documented as the first legal slave owner in Virginia, he petitioned the courts to own 2 black slaves. And that started, he ended up, I think, owning several more after that. I think it was like some 20 or 40. That brought up an interesting yet controversial issue for the government and for the state, because here it is, you've got black men who are petitioning the court to own slaves of their own kind, and that started popping up in other states in the South and throughout our nation.
Okay,
and
David.
So,
Go ahead.
So that kind of, I think that the black community in general doesn't look at or kind of glosses over some of these truthful things from the past, and I'm not sure why that is.
Okay, let's let our historian respond to some of the things that you said. Thank you. Thanks for calling. Go ahead, Cassandra. What do you think?
There's a wonderful book that was published. It's called Mine Own Ground, and it deals with the history of people on the Eastern Shore, which is where Anthony Johnson settled. That's where he was given head rights. And so I would definitely start with that particular book, because that documents this particular story, and I kind of like to put a few correctives in. Johnson was actually brought here from Angola, and so was, ironically, his wife. And he, unlike a lot of Africans who were here in this country in those early years, we're talking about the 1630s, actually 1620s, because so few African women were brought in. Most African men did not marry an African woman. Mm-hmm. If they married, it was usually a white indentured servant who was a woman, or it was an Indian. And mm-hmm. we know that there were laws quickly starting to get passed, which you would see by the 1660s, forbidding any interracial marriages. So a lot of this was going on then, and it continued even though the law was passed. So there was a failure to recognize the legal aspect of the marriage, but people were still intermarrying. Now, Anthony came in, as did all the Africans, as unfree people. These are, and I like to describe it as unnegotiated contracts. People who are coming in from Europe, they negotiated based on whatever money they had, the contract that they would have when they got here. And there were some kidnappings. They didn't have any control over their contracts either. But the Africans who were brought in did not have any control. And so it took Anthony years before he was finally able to gain his freedom. And when he did, as most indentured servants, he was given head rights so that he wouldn't become a burden on society, and that land was on the Eastern Shore.
Head right means what? They gave him land to go
live
on?
Right. It was land that would compensate a small amount to the work that he did for so many years. Okay. So his land was on the Eastern Shore, and he was very much an entrepreneur and did very well. Now, the case that was mentioned, where he was suing the government, this was discussed in detail in Mine Own Ground. And what actually happened is that there were a group of white plantation owners around him who were trying to deprive him of his land. And because they were very uncomfortable with the presence of an African who was doing well, who was competition. And you would actually see the changes in the laws, because by law he was supposed to be able to vote, but the House of Burgesses removed the right of African men, even though they were property owners in some cases, their right to vote. So in any case, he was his servant, and this is in the court cases, his servant, according to Anthony Johnson, was convinced by these white landowners to claim that he was holding him longer than his years of servitude. So even though some documents later are not documents but accounts of this, classified his servant as a slave, in point of fact, he wasn't a slave. He was accusing Anthony Johnson of holding him beyond his years of servitude. And in the first case, he won. The servant won, and then immediately went to work with one of the other white plantation owners. And then the following year, Anthony Johnson came back and sued to have him return. and showing documentation that, he in fact owed him more years of service and how he was falsifying his account and so forth. And he won. And so the servant was returned back to Anthony Johnson. Now, how long Johnson held him as a servant is really unknown, but we know that the courts came back and agreed with him. But it had to do with years of servitude as opposed to being a slave. But that was the interpretation later on by some historians, that this was a slave issue when it was actually a servant issue.
No, I think that's the thing that makes history so fascinating, but yet at times so able to be manipulated, because people tend to pick and choose the parts that perhaps make them feel most comfortable.
Right.
In terms of how we lay out history. So as we move forward into the 21st and 22nd centuries, and we'll be gone, but as our children and our grandchildren and their children learn about history, do you ever see the day when the whole story will actually be taught?
Yes, I do. And I do because there has been a long effort by historians, first African American historians and now the historical community, to reposition the narrative. As we talk about all different groups in our country and all different genders, it is important to not add to the narrative that's there, that is white male centered, but rather to transform the way that we even recount these stories. Because, for the most part, most of our narratives are piecemeal together based on whatever war occurred. Mm-hmm. And so you jump from one war to the next, or maybe there are major movements like the progressive movement. But when they talk about it, they talk about a few of the leaders, but they don't talk about the larger pool of leaders and how there's complexity in this story. There's a tendency of wanting to water it down to the least common denominator and only highlight a few things. And that really makes the story overly simplistic, when most stories about how societies evolved are very complex, and you run the danger when you overgeneralize what's going on. And so I think eventually historians will come up with a new narrative that's much more integrative. And if you look at some of your major historians, that's exactly what they're doing. Mm-hmm. They're pushing that envelope to make sure that the narrative is inclusive.
440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. What questions do you have about the contraband story? Do me a favor. Tie in Emancipation Oak to the people who were contraband. I mean, how did that all come together?
Well, it's interesting. That particular oak tree is still alive. Mm-hmm. And there's also the Algernon oak tree at Fort Monroe that goes back to even with the arrival of Africans in 1619. That tree has been there for at least, I understand, over 500 years. Emancipation Oak was reportedly a tree that Mary Peake and others who knew how to read and write, other free blacks who've been taught how to read and write, and who were working in churches, especially in Hampton you had First Baptist Church, in Norfolk you had First Baptist Church on Bute Street. You also had the Colored Methodist Church that later changed its name to St. John AME Church. In Portsmouth you had the Colored Methodist Church that changed its name later to Emmanuel AME Church. And so all these churches had small groups of people who knew how to read and write and who taught people how to read and write. And even some of the white churches in the area would have Bible schools for their black members, for the children of their black members, teaching them how to read. And so reportedly during the years just before the Civil War, they would gather under that tree and have reading sessions, and that tree became an important focal point for many African Americans in Hampton. And so when Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and people were anticipating, in fact, there were blacks from Hampton Roads, free and enslaved, who were part of groups who went up and met with Abraham Lincoln prior to January 1st of 1863 to convince him that he must issue the Emancipation Proclamation. And so they were all gathered together in anticipation. In Hampton, they were gathered around this oak tree that they called Emancipation Oak. And so when Lincoln issued it on midnight of January 1st, 1863, someone had the document that had been issued and read it to the crowd. And so every year following that, they would begin or end their commemorations of that moment around Emancipation Oak. And they took seedlings from that oak tree and planted it at different important sites throughout Hampton and Newport News. So there's a seedling that was there at Huntington High School. There's a seedling that's there at the Newsom House, and it's throughout Hampton. There are seedlings of Emancipation
Of the
Oak.
original tree. That's incredible. Michael joins us, and he's on the road. How are you, Michael?
I'm doing fine. How are you doing?
Good, doing great. What's your question?
My question is, I worked at Fort Monroe for 4 years, and General Lee was an engineer there. I think he was lieutenant, and he lived there. And I would like to know exactly what it was that he did as far as building the fort.
You're talking about Robert E. Lee?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
I'm not really familiar with the military history of the construction of the fort, except in general terms. I know that the fort had been built before Lee arrived there, and there were additions made as the years went on. But I'm really not familiar. I know he was imprisoned there after the war. Excuse me, not Lee, but Jefferson Davis was in prison there. But in terms of Lee's military career prior to becoming general of the Confederate Army, I'm really just not that familiar with it.
When all of the slaves started coming to Fort Monroe because they wanted to become contraband, wasn't that overwhelming for the fort? How did they deal with that?
Absolutely. In fact, many of the camps that were set up throughout the South, you had one in Alexandria, you had one in Yorktown, you had one in Washington, you had down there in South Carolina, Hilton Head and other places. In Norfolk, you had Craney Island, the city of Norfolk. One of the things is that they were ill prepared to handle the volume of people coming in, and you read these accounts of the desperate conditions, the need for food and water. In fact, the Alexandria camp was so bad with sanitation and water needs that 3 people died there every day. This was
not a party.
No, this was not a party. These were desperate conditions, and you had makeshift tents, and you had people with barely enough clothing to share among themselves. Because remember now, people were not only ill clothed as enslaved people, but during war it gets even worse. And literally, slaves only had the clothing on their backs. If you were a good slaveholder, you actually provided 2 sets of clothes for your slave per year. But many people in Norfolk and parts of Hampton hired out their own time. So they had to, with the money that they were able to earn after they paid their owner, they had to provide their own food, they had to provide their own clothing, and a place to live.
Oh, goodness.
And so, the conditions were very, very horrific. Fort Monroe didn't have the problem that Alexandria had in terms of water supply. They had a problem with water supply, but it wasn't as extensive and as desperate.
When someone now, today, wants to do the tour of the Civil Rights Tour or the Black History Tour throughout Hampton Roads. Are you having to revise it a little bit now since we know all this information about Fort Monroe and about Point Comfort and some other places? Are you constantly adding locations as time goes on?
Yeah, we are constantly adding locations, and one of the things that I would like to do is make sure that we have markers at all of these places. For example, it took me forever, and I owe a lot to the folks at the Sergeant Room, Bill Inge and Troy Vallos, for helping me to find out where Hall Slave Jail was located in Norfolk. And we found that it was located right at the entrance point where you have the circle to City Hall. Because in none of the city directories did they actually list the address. The slave market is right in front of where the Confederate monument is, off of Commercial Place. These were gathering places for people who were brought in and set up on contraband camps. And so we want to have markers for all these places so that people would remember where they were.
We just got a call. Someone called in to say that Robert E. Lee was an engineer and architect and built buildings at the fort. So I guess we'll have to look that up.
Well, I mean,
find that out.
you had a whole host of buildings. In fact, most people don't understand. You have the fort that's surrounded by the moat, and then you have all of these buildings surrounding the fort. So, it depends on what aspect or part of the fort that you're talking about.
We only have a few minutes left, so I wanted to remind people that even though Fort Monroe is officially closed as an Army base, the folks at the Casemate Museum want you to know that it remains open Monday through Sunday from 10 until 4:30. The beaches are open from sunrise to sunset. So is fishing from sunrise to sunset. Residential homes and office spaces are ready to be leased, and the Chamberlain and the Marina are still open, and all of the churches on base are still active and still available for worship services. The fire station is no longer working, and the City of Hampton Police will now cover that area. So I guess the saga continues.
Yes.
As we go on. Cassandra, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate, one, you stepping in, but also the way that you tell history is always just so fascinating. And so I'm sure that we'll continue to have conversations. And if you'd like to pick up a copy of Dr. Newby-Alexander's book, it's called An African American History of the Civil War in Hampton Roads. It's by Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander. Thanks again so much for joining us. And we'll be right back in just a moment. Have you ever gotten so caught up in an actor's performance that you forget that you're not really listening to the person they are portraying? That they're not really the person that they are portraying? Well, it's easy to do that when you're listening to Sheila Arnold. Sheila will take you back in time with any of the many characters she portrays, because as our Lisa Godley found out, Sheila Arnold loves what she does, and she does it well.
Cotton all day. My name is Old Bess. Not old because of old age. They just call me that because I've been around Master Sutherland so long. I live here in 1776 in Williamsburg, Virginia, the capital of Virginia. Well, when you've been around as long as I have, you done seen some things. Some things hurt so bad, you can't do nothing but sing about them. Oh, Lord, trouble so hard. Oh, Lord, trouble so hard.
Sheila Arnold has been a historic storyteller for 20 years. Her career began as her way of contributing something to her son's class. He was 5 years old at the time. Her talent then took her to Colonial Williamsburg in 1998, where she got paid to do what she loved.
Then in 2003, I left Colonial Williamsburg, seeing that there was an opportunity to share this type of craft, both storytelling and historic character presentations, with students throughout the country.
Arnold easily transforms into any one of the 10 different characters she portrays. Her favorite is the one she started with, Old Bess, an 18th century tavern slave working at the Raleigh Tavern in Williamsburg in the 1770s.
And I've had troubles along my way, but I have good things in my life too. I don't mind being a person that works real hard. I just don't like it when folk don't always remember the work I do.
Like all of her characters, Old Bess paints a picture of her life, her job, and her family.
There's my Caesar, he my husband. We jumped the broom some 26 years ago. You do know what jumping the broom is, don't you, baby? All right now. Now, some folk, they don't know, because you know what the law say. The law say is, that slaves cannot get married. That's what the law say. But can you stop somebody from loving somebody? Sure enough not. So we find our own way.
She performs for audiences of all ages, combining historical events with the life and times of her characters. Old Bess lives during a time when the country is moving toward independence.
Master Randolph, when he was alive, God rest his soul. Master Francis Lightfoot Lee, Master Richard Henry Lee, Master Thomas Jefferson, Master Patrick Henry. I've served all those men in my tavern. And they speak of liberty. I saw them same men on the day that Master Sutherland sailed my daughter. I stood at the bottom of those steps, and I watched as those men and women bed on my daughter. My daughter was sold to a man who lived in Fredericksburg. I know it don't mean much to y'all, but it means she can't come back home.
Arnold says one of the most rewarding things about what she does comes through comments made by her young audiences.
I always come out of character afterwards. And the most wonderful thing is to hear a kid say, I thought you were really her. I thought that was who it was. Or to have kids walk along in the emotions of that person with me. And they feel the anger, or they feel the sadness, or they feel the compassion. To have a middle school student say to me, I thought I had it tough because I couldn't do what I want to do. And you just told me I had so much to value. Don't nobody know my troubles but God. Don't nobody know my troubles but God.
For Another View, I'm Lisa Godley.
Wow, that's some powerful stuff. If you'd like to know how to reach Sheila Arnold, you can call our offices or check our website at anotherviewradio.org. And you know, the great thing about living in Hampton Roads is that there's always something going on. Let me tell you about a very special event coming up. It's the Surry County African American Family Reunion. It's happening on Saturday, September 24th and Sunday, September 25th from 10 to 6. The theme is How We Got Over, Looking Back in Wonder. This is a wonderful event for the entire family. There's music, food, vendors, and good, wholesome fun. And the folks in Surry certainly know how to make you feel at home. I've had the pleasure of attending this event, and it's a great time. It's at the Surry County Community Center at Enos Farm Road. For more information, call 757-813-0906 or 804-263-5156. And if you want to know what's going on this year in Norfolk Public Schools, plan to attend the Superintendent's Community Exchange Breakfast this Thursday, September 22nd at 7:30 a.m. at the Ted Constant Center. Dr. Richard Bentley will give the State of the Schools address, and yours truly will moderate a community discussion. Visit NorfolkEdFoundEvents.com for more details. There's more information on our website, anotherviewradio.org. I'm Barbara Ham Lee. Thanks for listening, and we'll be together again next Friday for Another View.